stand there and see the room fill up on an important subject matter is fake news. Hold on, please. Good morning. Don't be wise guys. Good morning and welcome to another Manlius Informed Special. And let us welcome back Roy Gutterman for the upteenth time since we started this series. Roy is the director of the Tully Center for Free Speech. He's associate professor at the Newhouse School on newspapers, online journalism. He also teaches magazine, newspaper, and online journalism, military, visual, journalistic communication, and television, radio, and film, computerization, and journalism. That's all. This along and a very long list of other law, media, and politics articles, interviews, and journalistic accomplishments. Professor Gutterman also sits on the board of local nonprofits and is a busy dude. When I asked him who would come and speak about the subject of fake news, he's replied, I can do that. Please let me quote exactly what Wikipedia reports as to what fake news is. Fake news is a type of yellow journalism that consists of deliberate misinformation and hoaxes spread via the traditional print or broadcasting news media or via internet-based social media. A report is fake news if it was written and published with the intent, remember that word intent, to mislead in order to gain financial or political advantage. So today we're going to learn from someone who knows, recognizes, and calls it as he sees it. No BS intended. Please, a late, warm April day, and welcome to our friend Roy Gutterman.
Thank you, Louis. It's great to be back here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about one of my new favorite topics. And fake news has sort of fallen in my lap for a couple of different reasons. I do teach journalism, but primarily I teach First Amendment law and free speech law, free press law. And this issue of fake news intersects with this in a million different ways. And we'll talk a little about some of the potential ramifications, the legal ramifications, and hopefully we'll have some time, plenty of time for questions. And if you can't hear me in the back, just let me know. I'll try to talk a little louder. Usually talk to big crowds.
Can you move the pedestal up a little bit? Then
I can move this thing anyway.
Yeah.
How's this?
You got to be in camera range.
I can't see. Okay. I like this. So, I'd like to take you back to 1835 in New York City. All right, I'm from outside New York. My folks were from New York City. My grandparents were from the city. So I understand New York City. I understand New York City media. But 1835 was the birth of the penny press. Right? These cheap newspapers on cheap print. It was kind of like a cotton print if you collect old newspapers or see old newspapers. These papers were produced very cheaply and started the burgeoning circulation wars for newspapers. And there's a newspaper called the New York Sun. And in an effort to boost circulation, the Sun and its editors and one particular reporter decided to run a series of stories called Celestial Discoveries. And these were investigative pieces that exposed and unveiled life on the moon. All right? And they based the sourcing on this on a South African astronomer who had some sort of special high-tech telescope who discovered, and quote, intelligent life on the moon. And the stories detailed vivid descriptions of these humanoid animals and winged creatures and an entire society that was viewable through this modern telescope. And one particular passage I'd like to read, quote, the story began, the Edinburgh Current, they were citing to another newspaper, we have just learned from an eminent publisher in the city that Sir John Herschel at the Cape of Good Hope has made some astronomical discoveries of the most wonderful description by means of an intense telescope and an entirely new principle. That was sort of the lead into the stories. And the stories ran for a little bit, and it boosted the newspaper circulation to 19,000 daily readers at a time when there were about 9 daily newspapers in New York City, and it suddenly catapulted this newspaper into a primo spot in the New York City newspaper wars. And shortly after that, they reprinted a bunch of these stories in a pamphlet. Pamphlets were very popular at the time, so they'd reprint things. And the pamphlets sold 20,000. And this was going on for a week or two until some of the other newspapers, which were, they appropriated the stories. They went on the equivalent of the wire services all around the world. Today we'd call that going viral, okay? But in addition to going viral, other newspapers and the competitors said, we're not quite sure about this. We're not quite sure there's really life on the moon in such vivid description. So the other newspapers started investigating this and exposed this as a hoax. Surprise, surprise, a hoax. And this was not the first media hoax, certainly not the last media hoax, but if in 21st century terms, I think we call this fake news. This was probably one of the first fake news stories that really went out there. And the only way it was debunked was by the other newspapers that were covering the competition, covering the world. And this anecdote is the subject of a real interesting book, The Sun and the Moon. You might even have it at the library here. This tells the whole story of the people involved, and it's kind of an interesting read if you're interested in journalism history and the characters of the time. It's pretty neat. So let's fast forward to today, where we have this specter of fake news and what it really means to not only the journalism business, but what it means to consumers and citizens, because we do have a serious issue here. And as we saw with the last election, fake news, the fake news phenomenon has definitely affected things. Pew did a study, the Pew Research Center did a study. Something like 60% of the respondents believed that fake news affected the outcome of the election. Okay? And now it's become part of our general nomenclature. We hear fake news bandied all the time. So we'll talk a little more about that. But there were a couple of pretty key stories that really exploded the fake news phenomenon. One is the so-called Pizzagate story. Is anybody familiar with Pizzagate? Okay. Somebody wrote a story that said a pizza parlor in the Washington, D.C. area was the front for a child prostitution ring that was supported and endorsed by Hillary Clinton. All right. Now, ordinarily, that would have been the end of the story, and people would have just rolled their eyes and said, hey, I don't believe that one. Maybe it just sounds like phony baloney. But some crazy guy in North Carolina believed it, went up to Washington with an assault rifle, and started shooting to liberate the kids who were in the basement. As far as I can tell, I think the only thing in the basement was just pizza material. I have it on good authority that it's a pretty good pizza place. I have a student who is from the Washington area and said it's a really good pizza place. So I'm going to be in D.C. in a couple of weeks. I might go out there. And, I'm almost afraid to go out there. One of the other major fake news stories that was influential in the campaign, some guy out in Ohio came across a theory that Hillary Clinton had stolen ballots in Ohio. Okay, and again, Ohio was predicted to be the key to the election. In some ways, it was. It was definitely the key to the election in 2000 and 2004. So, lots of stuff was happening in Ohio. So this guy wrote a story and said there were stolen ballots stored in a warehouse somewhere in southern Ohio. And to support his story, to document his story, he went on some photo database, right-clicked a photo of boxes, and said these were the boxes in the warehouse in Ohio. And apparently the photo that he used was not even it was an English photo. It was from England, so it wasn't even geographically accurate. So that story actually had some traction, and in some ways may have influenced voters in Ohio. Anybody know anything about the author of that story, by the way? He was a recent college graduate. He was a quarterback at Davidson College. Right? Not even Division A1. Right?
Is that athletically or academically?
Davidson's it's an elite university, but its athletics aren't. They're not up there. But who am I to talk, right? I work at Syracuse. But I've read some interviews by this guy, and what was his motivation? Right, his motivation was simple. He needed money, and he saw an opportunity to make money. And he made a lot of money with very little capital effort. He didn't have to do any work. He wrote this story. It looked real, sounded real, was in news style, and it had this outrageous theory. And somehow he got it up online, and it went viral. And monetizing these things is kind of an interesting thing. How do you make money doing this stuff? Right? He made money because he got clicks, and he sold advertising. And you compare the advertising revenues online to something in traditional media with magazines or newspapers or TV, and it's a fraction of what you can make, what a mainstream legacy news operation makes, but it adds up. So he made, I read he made tens, maybe $100,000 with very little effort, because the outrageousness of a story getting clicks. So that's how it gets monetized, and that's the new advertising model. So for those of you who read Syracuse.com, every time you click a story, there's a little check that goes into little box gets checked in some reporter's queue, and at the end of the year, there might be a bonus. I hear reporters get bonuses for driving traffic. So if there's a reporter you really like, click their stories. I'm not going to say if there's a reporter you don't like, don't click their stories either, but that's the converse. So, I mean, that's the reality of this enterprise, and a lot of people in the news business and in the free speech First Amendment arena and in journalism circles really abhor the term fake news, and I really don't like using the term fake news either, because that has a connotation. Right? When you add news to something, there's a connotation to news. Right? Fake is fake. Right? We know that. But when you hear the term news, what do you think?
Accuracy.
Accuracy. I heard dishonest. Okay, so you don't trust the news media. That's good. That's good. But you expect accuracy. What else do you expect?
We expect it to be verified.
Verified. Okay. Maybe objective to a certain extent, although that's a whole can of worms. But when you, like the last person getting the Post Standard nowadays, I still get it at home. Right? When you pick this up, you know that something went into it. Right? There were reporters who went out to get a story. You might not like the story, it might not be the best story, but there's certain things you can still trust with the newspaper. Okay, and it was verified, it was edited, so there shouldn't be typos or grammatical problems, but it happens anyway. Okay, so news, the term news actually does carry some weight. It does mean something. So to label fake news with this imprimatur of news is kind of inaccurate and possibly insulting to real news operations. So, again, going back to the 1800s with my Moon Man story, yeah, I don't think you would have called that news. Even fake news. What do you think we would call that? Fiction.
Science fiction.
Science fiction is, it's even more accurate. Crap, yeah. We're an adult audience. We can use grown-up words. What else would we call it?
We call it a lie.
Lies. I'd call it lies and hoax. A joke. Yeah, all that. It's all accurate. But I like hoaxes. I don't like hoaxes. I like to call them hoaxes because that's really what it was. It hoodwinked people. People believed it. Whether you really believed it or not, that's a different story. But I think the media and the people that are involved in news and subjects of news, I think, have done actual news a disservice by calling these hoaxes fake news. But I also think that plays into some of what's going on nowadays with the intersection between politics and media. Because now every story that President Trump doesn't like, what does he call? Fake news. Right? He's not calling it a hoax. He's not picking apart, intricate facts or details, or going one-on-one with actual evidence. He's just labeling fake news. And I don't like the story, it's fake news. Can't trust it. So, a little bit of a problem with that. And it's catching on. I saw a story a week and a half ago, an interview with President Assad in Syria, and he was questioned about the chemical attacks. And what did he label the chemical attacks? The reports on the chemical attacks. Fake news, right? So, and then I read there's a dictator in the Philippines now. The president of the Philippines has actually bragged about killing people himself. So, he too, stories he doesn't like, fake news. And I believe in Turkey, where there's, they're dealing with pretty much a dictator there, I believe he's referred to stories he doesn't like as fake news. But in Turkey, he's also, the president of Turkey's also removed editors from newspapers that he didn't like as well. So these are the people who are calling our news fake news: dictators, killers, and tyrants, and President Trump. So this is where we're going with this, and part of the problem, part of the concern with the labeling is that it delegitimizes legitimate news, real news, and that's been part of his campaign since he unveiled his campaign. Whether he was picking fights with Megyn Kelly, right? Who, again, I don't know why he was picking fights with Megyn Kelly other than to get on to get the headlines, because she's kind of a conservative. So, she was probably going to be on his team, and it's been more prevalent with with the media he doesn't like the New York Times. Right? He's calling the New York Times fake news. All the news that's fit to print, all of a sudden it's fake news because he doesn't like it, and and that extends to. I think there's a sort of a trickle-down effect when the leader of the country is overly critical to the point where it's more than just criticism. It's personal, it's delegitimizing, and it's minimizing the role of the press, the independent press, and it trickles down, right? We see it trickle down to other countries, we see it trickle down to other branches of government, at least in the executive. I'm still waiting to see how the administration deals with freedom of information requests, because that's going to be a serious issue. But you see other politicians lower down the food chain following this lead and sometimes singling out reporters berating reporters, labeling legitimate news as fake news, and it trickles down to all of us, really. So we do have some concern with that. I did bring another couple of props. I brought my own fake news story. I collect old newspapers. I found this. An old National Enquirer story. Kills son and feeds corpse to pigs. And consider the source, the National Enquirer. This is from 1966. Unfortunately, I just have the front page. I don't have the inside, so I couldn't actually see what the story is. But I think that could probably fall under one of our media hoax stories as well. So, again, our labeling here, the labeling of legitimately generated, gathered, professionally produced news as fake news becomes pretty troubling, because it totally minimizes what journalists do. And I know a little about what journalists do. I used to be a reporter, and I was a reporter in Cleveland for several years, and I know what reporters do. What do reporters do? When you read a newspaper, what?
They search out.
They search things out. They talk.
Verify.
What was that?
They verify.
Verify. Right. I wish I had $1 for every wonderful story I started with. The next Watergate, and then I started looking into it, and I was like, it's not panning out the way it was initially presented. And next thing you know, I don't even have a story because I can't verify anything, and it's not. And I wasn't gonna create fake news. So, yeah, verifying, checking the facts, talking to people, talking to a lot of people, asking questions, and again, on top of that, we also have access to anything you need to verify with one of these. I don't know what it's like to be a reporter today when you can just go onto your phone and check everything out. Right? Probably a lot easier, but I think it's also a lot harder because you then have to verify, and you have to still go to the source. You've got to find the source, and it's kind of a fun thing to do. It's like putting a puzzle together every day, or several times a day. And the best reporters who do that, really do it well, and other reporters don't do it so well, and that's sort of why we get into this sort of situation. So, again, professionally gathered information. There is value to that. There's a reason why the New York Times has a million paper readers every day, and close to, again, I don't know, the last time I checked it was 9 to 10 million online readers. Might be even more. Okay? Because you need information you can trust. You need those people going to places to ask those questions. Right? We can't go down to the White House every day. We're here in Syracuse. Somebody's got to go ask the questions. Somebody's got to check the data. Somebody's got to check the documents. And reporters do that on our behalf, whether it's Washington or Syracuse or next door with a village or town. And unfortunately, we don't have as many reporters doing that. I mean, that's one of the things that I lament every time I pick up a local newspaper. You all know that even 5 to 10 years ago, you probably had somebody who would cover an event like this. Whether it's newsworthy or not, that's a different story. But you'd have a reporter in town who would come and would find out what's going on and write it up and be right there. Somebody going to the village meetings, the school board meetings. And because the revenue stream isn't there, you're not seeing a lot of that anymore. So in some ways, I think the mainstream media is somewhat responsible for allowing this vacuum to open up for these fake news hoaxes to come in and absorb the readership. So in some ways, the traditional reporter is even more important now than it was 10 years ago because of the explosion of fake news, because the explosion of the internet. But it's a double-edged sword, right? It can be a problem, but it's easy to debunk as well, because all of us, each one of you, has access to debunk fake news, right, with the internet. How many of you are online and use the internet, do things online, right? Each one of us, all you need is an internet connection, and you can be the next person rebutting the fake news. And again, you can be the next person writing the fake news too. So, I don't want to encourage anything like that, but if you need a little extra money, I've got a fake news victim story to come up with in a minute too. So, yes.
What's the difference between fake news and alternate facts?
Well, that's the alternate. The alternate facts are a spin-off of the fake news. Again, all the language and the new things that this administration has given us. The alternate facts thing from Kellyanne Conway exploded right after she said it. She was. The problem with sometimes talking, off the cuff or off the tip of your tongue, is you're probably not always thinking about what you're going to say. And either the alternate facts line was totally off the cuff and just inane stuff coming out of somebody who's not quite prepared for the job that she's in, or it was a carefully constructed message that was constructed in some back room, some smoke-filled room, by a bunch of people who want to manipulate the media. We'll never know, because no one will tell you the truth anyway. But yeah, that's the spin-off, and to play with alternative facts. Last year, another term was entered into the dictionary called post-truth. Right? We live in a post-truth environment, a post-truth society, and that was in the 2016 Oxford Dictionary. That was one of the new words. So, all these new terms, all these different ways of categorizing information, it sounds somewhat Orwellian in many ways. I did a thing at the Palace Theater about a month ago on 1984, and it forced me to reread the book. And I was rereading the book, and I was cringing because it sounded so familiar with what we're dealing with today. And it's worth a reread if you haven't read it in a while. The movie was more depressing than the book, but the book was pretty depressing too. But it all plays into controlling information. And what better way to control information than to debunk it or to raise questions about it right off the bat? And we just keep seeing that. And every day, I was talking with Lewis before we started. Every morning I wake up and I turn on CNN, and I'm almost afraid to see what I'm going to see. Because you never know what kind of information is going to be tweeted out overnight. And some of the, and I don't want to get political, but some of the people in the administration just are not ready for public service and government work. And it's not easy. It's not easy to run a government, and it's not easy to deal with all the stuff that comes across the president's desk. So if you're not up for the job, what better way to deflect or to control than to tweet something out in the middle of the night, or to criticize the messenger, criticize the press, and get us all off the track. So either this is, again, history is going to determine and tell us the story one day, that either it was all a concerted effort, orchestrated for a purpose, or it was just a bunch of guys who were just not ready for prime time or ready for the job that they were in, or just not as smart as they thought they were. It's time is going to tell, but the only way time's going to tell any of that is through media coverage, right? And one of the things that really struck people in the media as unfair or unnecessarily belligerent was the way President Trump had singled out specific members of the media and berated them and insulted them and fomented crowds against them. And it's lousy to do, but reporters have to have thick skin, right? If you're not being yelled at by people, you're probably not doing your job as a reporter. It comes with the territory. But the more troubling element here was the exclusion of specific reporters from press briefings. Okay, that's content discrimination. That gets pretty close to violating the First Amendment and further minimizing the role of the press as an institution, right? As the unofficial fourth branch of government, the fourth estate, sitting there as the guard dog, the watchdog, whatever kind of dog you want to put into this fight, right? But it's the media is there because we need their information. We need to be able to make informed decisions, and to specifically exclude specific members of the media is a troubling thing. I mean, that's dictator sort of stuff. And again, it's not just it's not excluding the Post Standard or the Daily Orange. It's excluding the New York Times, right? The paper of record. So if the New York Times can't cover the story, well, who's going to cover it?
Or any press.
Or any press. Yeah.
Just not the New York Times, which you and I hold as the God. I understand that. But if you can't have a free press in a world that you're secondhand, you're stuck to the hand, as we say.
Yeah, it's dictator sort of stuff. So, luckily, there is some sympathy and some coordination among media sources. I know the Associated Press, which is really the news organization of record. The AP is everywhere, all around the world, and it's the largest news organization in the world, and it does the best reporting. The AP pulled their reporters out of some of these meetings and briefings that the president excluded the Times from. So, some of the president's anti-press policy and rhetoric and practice is really kind of naive when you think about it, because even if he could tweet something out in the middle of the night, he still needs the mainstream institutional press to be able to get his policy messages not only out to the American public, but to the rest of the world, right? Diplomacy is done by reading newspapers. Espionage is done by reading newspapers as well, but I don't want to go down that road. But the way heads of state talk to other heads of state without picking up the red phone is through the media. And whether President Trump wants to acknowledge that or not, the reality is he's going to have to. And it was interesting because the day the healthcare legislation was rejected, anybody know who Trump's first phone call was to?
Washington Post.
Washington Post and New York Times, right? He called the New York Times to complain that Congress just stuck it to him, right? So, well, yeah, and that's a whole different. I mean, I'm not an expert in healthcare law, but the political bedfellows in that one is Shakespearean in some ways. But again, he realized if he needed to get something out to the public, he needed to get it out cleanly and, you know, relatively objectively, he still needed to call the New York Times or some form of the institutional press.
Isn't that only New York Times?
I think he also called the Washington Post, and then he did a lot of press afterwards.
You always said failing.
The failing New York Times, yeah, that somehow,
That's an interesting juxtaposition. One day he calls it the failing New York Times, and the next day he calls it the New York Times because he knows that the New York Times will accurately quote him and accurately tell a story.
the day he fails, he has to call the New York
You can't have it
Times.
both ways.
Yeah. I mean, again, the inconsistencies are fairly obvious, but it's an adventure. It really is. Every day's an adventure, and we're not quite sure where we're going. But yeah,
Who really benefits from spewing or proselytizing fake news? I mean, who gains by it? Right now, we're in a room of 65 people who believe the way you and I believe. For the I can, yeah. But I'm sure you're grasping the concept that I'm trying to say. But who benefits from this, what we call in the street total BS?
right. Obviously, the writers, the propagators of this, right? If they're there was a great story in the Times about one of the first authors of fake news. There's a couple of guys who ran a taco truck, and they decided they wanted to make more money, so they started doing fake news. So again, no criticism of taco cooks, but you know, these aren't bona fide reporters. So you know, there's obviously the financial benefit that people gain from that, but you know, from a political standpoint, destabilizing the news media plays into the hands of people running the show, right? I mean, again, it's all very 1984, because you know, every time President Trump tweets out some anti-press vitriol in the middle of the night, you know, the press has this knee-jerk reaction to go for the bright, shiny object, and the news cycle is dominated by, you know, the press's sky is falling reports on, you know, the administration wanting to, you know, shut down journalism. So, in some ways, the administration gets a benefit from this because there's no critical coverage of policies. There's no critical coverage of some of these cockamamie executive orders or the cabinet nominations. I mean, a lot of the fake news stories, or you know, a lot of the anti-press vitriol that President Trump was spewing came out during the confirmation process, right? With all these Goldman Sachs guys who are now running, you know, in the cabinet, or Betsy DeVos, who's never been in a public school in her life, and you know, so the press has to go cover all this stuff, but they're distracted by, you know, this First Amendment crisis that Trump manufactured overnight. So, you know, controlling the story or destabilizing the story benefits people who want to obfuscate or sneak something by.
Yes, recently there was a headline in the Post-Standard News that Fox News dumped disgraced Bill O'Reilly, using the words dump and disgrace. Now, evidently the media can use any words they want, whether they're true or not.
I mean, that's clearly an opinion. I mean, the headline is clearly imbued with opinion. I don't think dumped is necessarily pejorative. I mean, I think it's a pretty accurate verb to use on that. Disgraced?
Disgusting.
Well,
Or it was caught. I mean, it's got out.
Well, why don't you
Well,
just
what-
simply state the fact that he was terminated and then go on into the story, why do they have to have that dumped and disgraced in there?
So your concern is, which bothers you more, the dumped or the disgrace?
What?
Which word bothers you more?
Both of them.
Both.
Okay.
You know, headline, let me tell you a little secret about headline writing. Headlines are written by editors, at least they used to be. Not necessarily the reporters who write the stories. And, you know, headlines are intended to lure people into a story. And, you know,
Or true or not true, right?
well, they still have to reflect the overall tenor of the story, but they will be a little more enticing to a reader. And and headlines have to have more action. Right? They use more, you know, the best headlines have the best action words. So, dumped is a pretty strong word.
Roy,
Yes.
there's this terminology called, I might be not having the exact definition.
Ombudsman. Okay.
The ombudsman is the person who represents the reader to the editorial department of that media, i.e. the New York Times. It's basically the person who is reporting that view from the reader's standpoint. The New York Times has been running this department called the public editor for the last 8 or 10 years. And one of the columns that they wrote about was how the New York Times changes the headline during the day. Because they have this great affection to be accurate with their headlines and as it employs the internet. Most of their readers today read the same article, or a lot of them read the same article, but they read to see how that headline has changed during the day. They give it a different view, a different twist. And it has very little to do with fake news. All they're doing is trying to help the reader understand what the story is going to contain. That's all they're trying to do in terms of the New York Times. I would imagine other publications are doing the same thing in changing the headline as the story evolves through the day. One other thing I'd like to add.
Well,
If you read carefully, when they quote the man who was in the White House, they say he tweeted. They don't say he spoke on record. He said that it's quoted as he tweeted. Well, right away, you're getting some sort of a glow to fake newsery by them using the tweeter expression.
well, you know, the beauty of online journalism is that it can be updated and clarified and changed during the day. So the Times does a pretty good job of updating stories. You know, in the old days, there were multiple editions to a daily newspaper. There'd be the early edition, the later edition, there'd be regional editions. Well, and if you paid close attention, or if you could get these different editions, there'd be very subtle differences. You know, breaking news would be different, but you know, we only have one edition of the newspaper now. But with the website, you can update throughout the day as stories change, and that's when headlines get changed. So, I mean, there's a beautiful element to that as well.
The word you used, vitriol, is one of the things that disturbs me the most with what's happening. During the campaign, people were sickened by the language, the insults and so on. Sad to say, my nephew is Trump's social media director, and so he tweets.
Is he the one tweeting the stuff out in the middle of the night?
Yeah, no, during the day. He's the one who threatened Megyn Kelly, did the Jewish Star. That's my nephew, unfortunately. And I would from
But
time
you're
to
claiming
time.
it.
We can't hear you.
So I would from time to time take a look at what his tweets were during the campaign, and every time he referred to Hillary Clinton, it was always with the word crooked in front of it. And none of that has changed, it seems. You know, we're still getting this kind of insult-based rhetoric from, and it's become part of our lives now, which I don't think it ever was to this extent. And it's extremely concerning, that this is now part of our vernacular. Post-truth is probably part of that whole thing, that we have a whole new language around what's been going on.
Yeah. So her nephew is social media director?
Yeah.
Social media
Through the
director.
campaign and now in the White House. Sits with Steve Bannon now, sits in his office now.
You're kidding.
I'm not kidding.
Does he wash his hands every time he leaves?
He's fine with it. He worked for Trump for 10 years. He ran one of his golf clubs, and started his academy and so on, one of those stories. But, it's a hard thing. It's a very difficult thing. But I never saw, and even now, he's the one who just threatened the Freedom Caucus guy, and they said he might have violated the Hatch Act. But there doesn't seem to be any restraint in that, no sense that there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, well, we live in divisive times right now. I mean, there are no, the parties are really polarized. We have no, there may be 2 or 3 moderate Republicans, and there's maybe 1 conservative Democrat, and there's not a lot of middle ground. And I don't know where we're going to go with this.
But that speaks to freedom of speech, which you have touched on in the past here. And
Yeah.
maybe you could just touch on it again about what's okay and when is it not okay, to lie and make things up, or.
Again, the question of, how far can you go in a free speech environment? Right? The limits of the law on reining in vitriol, or outright lies, or
You can't
threats.
yell fire.
And you can't yell fire in a theater and cause a panic when there's no fire. So, there are limits, but the limits are very precise. So, the true threat doctrine is sort of, and again, I'm throwing legalese at you, but a true threat that you're intending to hurt somebody and cause harm to them, and it's a real palpable threat, can be a limit on free speech, or can be limited without violating free speech. However, there's a lot of gray in that area.
Like the pizza place.
Like the pizza place. But, I'm not sure you could rein in, legally restrain fake news without violating the First Amendment. As bizarre as it is that, the taco guy or the former quarterback or, the crazy guy in his parents' basement writing fake news, still has his First Amendment right to produce fake news. I can't see a legitimate way to rein that in without violating the First Amendment, which then puts a burden on everybody else to be active readers, critical readers, and to question the sourcing. Has anybody actually seen fake news? Has anybody actually seen one of these? What have you seen?
Well, the Pizzagate stuff, for instance.
You saw the fake. How did you get access to the Pizzagate story?
Well, it was more reading stories about it.
All right. So you read the stories about the Pizzagate, and then you went and
Yeah.
saw.
But I have a question about countering fake news. There's been an increasing body of research by psychologists, behavioral economists, and so on, that we don't make decisions rationally. We use shortcuts, heuristics, emotional considerations, unconscious biases, and then we create rational and logical explanations and tell ourselves the story that this is why we have this belief, when in fact the experiments show that's not the case. And this cuts across the line: conservative, liberal, fundamentalist, atheist, pro-science, anti-science. You do these experiments, everyone comes out the same. So given that our underlying mental or neural makeup is such that we don't really come to our beliefs and decisions rationally. And even more recently, there's evidence that we do it based on groupthink and what people in our group think about various issues. And again, it cuts across lines. How do you convince someone? Facts won't do it, because this applies equally to liberals and conservatives. So facts are preaching to the choir, and even though it's important to get the facts out, you don't change people's opinions that way.
All right, I'm done.
That's a tough question.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I mean, you're quoting science, and you know, science doesn't lie. So, you know, multiple sourcing. You know, don't just read. You know, don't just read the New York Times. Don't just read the Post Standard. Don't just read the Washington Post. Right? Take a look at Breitbart. Take a look at MSNBC. Figure it out. You know, you've got to have a lot of stuff, and then maybe you'll figure out something somewhere in between.
Yeah, but you need 30 hours in a day.
Oh, yeah. It takes time to be well informed.
Right. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Senator, talking about the fake news, and we should look into the story recently happened about the Voice of America, VOA, interviewed a Chinese criminal businessman, refugee to America, and the VOA reports and interview that person 3 hours, and after 1 hour, the story was cut. Now, this is a very interesting story. That means American government sponsored the news media creates a fake news. Why it says a fake news? How we can ask a criminal person to comment about what he did is right or wrong. That is a totally nonsense.
Yeah.
Free comment.
I'm not familiar with that story, but you know, Voice of America sort of straddles the line between news and government-sponsored news. In some circles, we might call it propaganda. But I mean, I've been interviewed by Voice of America a couple times, and the reporters sounded legit, and their stories were reflective of legitimate issues. But you know, Voice of America serves an important purpose abroad for American interests, and you know, ostensibly, or the reporters and editors there adhere to journalistic standards. So you know, I'm not familiar with the story of the Chinese criminal, but you know, maybe they messed up too, or maybe it was a deliberate story as well. I don't know what the motivations were or would have been, but yeah.
Oh, by the way, the girl who interviewed the guy, she is a graduate from the Silicon University.
All right. The girl that wrote the story for Voice of America that interviewed a Chinese criminal was one of our graduates. Can you send me the link to that story? Can you send me the link? I want to make sure she wasn't one of mine. You had your hand up, sir?
Yeah. In today's political world, is there anything that falls under a legal category of slander that one person can take to court saying, you know, it is not a political accusation, it's actually a personal slander?
It's a great question. Again, we talk about the controls, the potential controls for fake news or vitriol or comments we don't like, and the law of defamation can be one of these areas to control. Law of defamation is broken down into slander, which is spoken, libel, which is written or in some sort of printed form. And I know there are probably a couple of attorneys in the room. Defamation is the way we protect our reputations. It's a civil liability issue. So if you were to go home later and write up a letter to the editor, to the Post Standard, say, well, Gutterman spoke like he molests kids. Right? Probably one of the worst things you could say about somebody. And for the record, a false statement, I might add. Right, so Again, now with that out there, people would look at me funny, maybe I get fired from my job, I'd be able to come up with some sort of provable harm, monetary harm. And the way I could punish you for saying that is by suing you the same way the heavy hitters would sue somebody who ran into a car or something. So there is a check. But it's not an easy cause of action. It's not an easy thing to sue for and collect on for a couple of different reasons. One is the standards for public figures or public officials. So I could stand here and say President Trump looks like, what did I heard somebody say yesterday.
Orangutan.
He looks like an orangutan. They test medicine on him. Right? So probably not a nice thing to say about somebody, but he is the president, and I have my First Amendment right to say that. Plus it's opinion, right? It's not approvable. It's not a provable matter of fact. But if I say Donald Trump is a rapist, which is what a lot of people said, right? When you go back to the campaign, that's a provable fact. So, maybe I did harm his reputation with that. And if he wanted to sue me, he would have to sue me under this more rigorous standard, where he would have to prove that I knew it was false or I had reckless disregard for the truth. They call that actual malice. For those of you who are really interested in this, it goes back to the 1960s and a libel case against the New York Times by a Southern police commissioner in Montgomery, Alabama, who disliked the critical coverage that the New York Times was including during the civil rights era and segregation in Jim Crow South. So in an effort to punish the New York Times for publishing false things about him, he sued the Times for defamation, won at the state court level, and the Times appealed all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court revolutionized or constitutionalized defamation law in order to allow a little more wiggle room in dealing with public issues and public officials and public affairs. So it would be very difficult to bring a successful defamation lawsuit against somebody who's talking about public officials or public affairs. And that's an important element of our First Amendment law and our free speech and free press law. And then to go back, again, to bring this back to the campaign, remember back in, it was like July, where candidate Trump said he's going to open up libel law. That was one of his promises. I'm going to open up libel law so people like me can have an easier time to punish people like them, right, the press, from publishing all these awful things about him. Right? He promised to open up libel law, which from a presidential, from a governance standpoint, the president can't do that. Right? Libel law is state law. Every state has its own formulation, and there's no such thing as federal libel law. And on top of that, the president doesn't have power to do anything like that anyway, on its face. However, we're talking about Supreme Court doctrine here. We're talking about Supreme Court precedent. And the backdoor way to open up libel law would be to appoint Supreme Court justices who disagree with this First Amendment philosophy, with the actual malice standard from the Times v. Sullivan case from 1964. So there is a backdoor way that he could change libel law. Get a couple of Supreme Court justices who don't support the doctrine, and then get a test case to find its way through the system.
Well, interestingly enough, Melania Trump just made this defamation thing work for her.
Yeah.
She needs the money.
I'm sure she needs the money. Melania Trump just got a defamation judgment, a settlement, and it was in England, where the defamation laws are different. The defamation laws in England are way more plaintiff-friendly than they are here. Right? There's no First Amendment in England. There's no actual malice standard. So public figures like Melania Trump have an easier time bringing lawsuits in foreign jurisdictions. They call that libel tourism. So you look for the country that has the most favorable libel law and to sue there.
You were going to talk about a victim being victimized?
I wouldn't say I was victimized. I was.
No, not you personally, but you had a victim story.
I
Was it
have,
yours?
I have a fake news story.
Okay.
Fake news, I collided with fake news last week. Last Monday, I did an interview with a web-based news organization out of California. They wanted a quick quote on the guy, that crazy guy in Cleveland who killed somebody and put it on Facebook. So they called me, I said a couple things, and it got published almost immediately on the web. And then the next day, I was talking with the PR guy, one of the PR guys at the university, News Services, because they've got some sort of Google alert search for Syracuse University, and my name came up, and they put it out every day. You know, all the Syracuse University professors who get quoted, they put out a list of all the quotes that they got. So he called me up, and he was going to put out a couple of quotes that I made. And he said, yeah, I like what you said in the Village Sun-Times. I was like, the Village Sun-Times? I don't know who the Village Sun-Times is. And then he read me the quote, and I said, well, I said part of that, but those other two quotes I didn't say. And then he said, oh, well, that's weird. And then he sent me the link, and I looked at the link, and I read through the quotes, and there were 3 direct quotes attributed to me, one of which I said to the other source, to the other publication. The other 2 I didn't say at all. And so I was misquoted in the Village Sun-Times. That's kind of peculiar. And then I looked into what the Village Sun-Times is. And I've got the printouts. I should have brought my computer to show you. I don't know if it's even up. But I started looking at this, and I said, this doesn't look like a real news operation. It doesn't look like a real newspaper. And then I looked at it, and the name of the publication is the Village's Sun-Times, all one word, which doesn't make much sense from a news standpoint. But then I read, there was a link, and about, you can link and read about the publication. So I'll just read a little of about the Village Sun-Times to you. The Village's Sun-Times is the head news and data site in the United States, pulling in a great deal of special clients consistently. It gives a key day in and day out news, data, and social connection system, gathering from numerous sources to illuminate, draw in, and to stimulate. And then it says, covering neighborhood and national news, games, expressions, and excitement data. I don't even know what excitement data is. Group occasions, climate, movement, and more. And it goes on for another paragraph. And I quickly surmised that this was fake news. This was a fake news site. And then I looked at it more further, and there was like, there's a link, contact link. So for editorial questions and thoughts that concern more than one of the local's publications, I mean, it doesn't even make sense, this language. So there was an info email link.
So is being misquoted, I mean, do you have any recourse? Or is that allowed under the First Amendment?
I mean,
I'm not thinking would, but theoretically.
cosmetically, how would it look, the free speech guy suing a fake news
No,
organization?
theoretically.
But, I mean, there have been several defamation cases over the years where the plaintiff argues that his or her reputation was damaged by false quotes or quotes that were falsely attributed to the person. So in a strict legal sense, there is a potential cause of action. There's potential for a lawsuit if crazy quotes are attributed to somebody. There's a famous case against the New Yorker in the late 80s, early 90s, where a pretty famous freelance reporter made up quotes and attributed them to the subject of her story. Literally made up quotes and made him look like a lunatic. So he brought a lawsuit, and he ended up winning, but never got any money. And it ended up going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And after the Supreme Court ruled on it, it went back down. And there were actually 2 libel trials based on this. And both times, the jury was unable to come up with a viable amount of money to repair this guy's reputation for quotes that were falsely attributed to him that made him look bad. So the flaw in my lawsuit against the Village Sun-Times, whoever the Village Sun-Times is that these quotes really don't make me look bad. Because it sounds like something I would have said anyway. It just wasn't stuff that I did say. So, you know, maybe I should be flattered that the Village Sun-Times has figured that I'm worthy of fake news. Maybe I finally made it.
Early on in the administration, they talked about, that press briefings had always been done in the White House, but the press was going to be moved off into some other building. Did that ever actually happen? And do you think, the press was upset about that they felt they'd be losing access somehow. Did it actually happen?
No, they haven't moved the press out yet.
Yeah.
I think there'd be blowback. Again, I think there's still some pockets of the professional administrative armaments that understand that they do need the press there. Even if they don't like them, they do need the press there to communicate with the rest of the world. And I mean, to the administration's credit, they have opened up some access to alternative media. So they now have, like, Spicer has a computer screen behind them where every day some new media source Skypes in or comes in through modern media. So they have opened it up a little bit. They've also given more space to some of their allied media as well. But press conferences, from a journalistic standpoint, reporters really get very little out of a press conference. The real news gathering occurs in these off-the-record discussions or these briefings or these clandestine conversations between reporters and staffers. And press conferences are sort of a show, but they're an important show, and they do set the tone for the administration. They send a message to the rest of the world. And part of the problem, one of the things that for the last 100 years, the United States has really been sort of a beacon for free press rights around the world. There's an organization out of New York City called Committee to Protect Journalists, which has a mission to protect journalists around the world. I do some side work with that. And it's really going to be harder for Americans to go and point our judgmental finger at dictators and organized crime and all these miscreants who are killing reporters or putting reporters in jail. It's going to be really hard for us to point our finger at them and say, you're doing a bad thing, when our president is going up and trashing reporters or criticizing reporters in a really vocal way. I mean, that's an international concern for me.
Just last week, I attended an Oasis class titled Between the Wars. Talked about the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, and the thing in common was that they all put down first the press and then they took the press over. So what you just said is very important.
Yeah, well, this is what keeps me up at night.
Earlier you asked, someone asked about the consequences of fake news. One of them that's unfortunate is you kind of suffer from outrage fatigue or crisis fatigue. If you've gotten involved with any liberal or democratic groups or made any kind of contribution, for instance, your inbox is deluged every day. You get emails from Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic National Committee, and they all say things like, crisis, urgent, needs immediate action. And when everything's a crisis, by definition, a crisis is something that stands out. When everything's a crisis, and everything needs immediate action, it's like nothing's a crisis.
Yeah, the boy who cried wolf. Right? The fables we're living proof of the fables.
I think that when you're talking about nothing is a crisis, I think that the most important is last week when the American news coming out to say that the carrier heading toward the North Korea. And I think that now that is a very big problem for the United States in the future, especially about dealing with North Korea.
Yeah, and again, I'm not an international affairs expert, but I read the newspapers and, you know, I get access to the same information you get, and it's scary.
It's scary, yeah.
Very scary, but, you know, hopefully, you know, cooler heads will prevail, and, you know, the news media will help us, you know, leverage and lobby and, you know, call our senators and congresspeople and make sure that some of the will of the people is reflected and that we're not delving into a nuclear war in the Korean Peninsula, but
Sure.
we'll see.
Yeah, that's scary.
How's that for an uplifting morning talk? At any rate, thank you.
Couple of thoughts.